So in yesterday's web dev tip, we got our front-end web app talking to our API by fixing the cause problem. But what we want to do now is when we've got a response back from the API, instead of logging something out to the console as we are at the moment, what we want to do is actually put an element on the page to actually display something to the user so they can copy the URL and then use the actual URL that we're creating for them. So having thinking about the design for this, there's a few options as to where we could put that. I think what might be quite nice is to sort of inject an element just in between the strapline and the button itself with the URL in there. And then if the user wants to create another rickroll URL, a different one, they can just press the button again to create another short URL if they need to. So the job for today is to basically take the response that we're getting here from the console and move that into a human readable format on the page by creating some elements. So let's go ahead and leave the API from here. And we'll get back to the index page that we've been working on. So as mentioned, we're going to be putting an element in between here, between the H2 and the button. So there are two approaches that we can do. We can actually leave a placeholder element that we can inject some content into with our JavaScript, or we could create the elements using JavaScript and then using JavaScript insert them after this H2 element. I think probably the second approach is cleaner because the markup doesn't get cluttered with lots of placeholder div elements, for example, but that we'll use the first approach with these placeholders, at least for the moment, just so you can see what's going on and what the intention is. And there is no real problem in doing it. As I say, it just clutters up the markup a little bit. And we're going to give it an ID so that we can target it specifically with our JavaScript. And I'll just give it a name such as, let's call it URL result for the ID. So now we can use that ID in our TypeScript or JavaScript, if you will, to actually target that element, and then we can populate some content inside there. So what we're going to do inside of our main.ts, this is the event listener that's going to get triggered when the user has clicked the button. So we're going to create a function inside of this then block. Instead of logging the details out to the console, we're actually going to update that element. So there's just one thing here with the fetch API. The first response that you get from the promise that's delivered from fetch is actually doesn't have the data that we're after. So if we have a look at what we've got in the response object here, you can see it's got lots of information about the request that's been made, such as the status and things like that. But the actual body of it inside there is a stream. So there's another promise inside there that we can use. In fact, if we look on the prototype, you can see there's another function called JSON, which will get the data for us in a JSON format. So this will be familiar to you if you've ever used fetch before. But instead of just straight away accessing the data, we get the result, and then we return another promise from the function, and then if we create another then block, the value that's inside of here will be we'll call it result, and actually I'll just change this just so it's not so confusing. We'll say the result is the actual JSON data that we've got back. So just to show you what that looks like this time, so let's say console log result. Let's go into the web app again and clear the console. And we'll click the create button again. And now we're getting some different output in the console. Instead of the actual network request details and the streams that are associated with it, we've actually got the JSON payload from the API. And as you can see, we've got in here the result and also the URL, which is the actual thing that we're after to display to the user. Okay, so the variable that we've got inside of here is called result, but there's also a property on that variable called result. So just to make things a little bit simpler, because we're not interested in a lot of the other content, I'm just going to destructure the result property from that object that's returned, and then now when we create a new URL, we're just getting this bit of information here because we're only really interested in this ID property from that result object. So that's just making our life a little bit easier. So all we need to do now really is to get the element on the page and update contents of that with this URL property that's available on the result. So I've forgotten already what I called that. So yeah, URL result. So up here, where we're actually defining the action button as well, I'm just going to create a new variable that's available throughout the scope of this onload function, and we'll say it's URL result. and it's equal to document get element by ID URL result. And now with that variable, what we can do is instead of just logging something out to the console, we'll say URL result. And there are different things that we can utilize here. We might want to put in HTML content. We might want to put in just some text. And all we're doing really is taking the URL property from the object and putting that on the page. So what I'm going to do is say the text content of that div is equal to the result.url. So let's save that and let's see how that looks when we create a new rickroll URL. So we'll click that again. And now you can see the URL that we've created is now inserted into the page. Okay, so that's working as expected. Let's add a little bit of styling to this content before we finish up the tutorial today. So let's go to our index page. So I'm going to add a class onto this element as well. So let's just say result is the class, and we could nest this inside of the strapline block that we've got in our SCSS here. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to set the color of the text to white. I might also set it to be bold as well. We're going to add a little bit of padding all around. And what I'll do as well is just add a little bit of border. So maybe 2 pixels, solid and white. So if we go and have a look at how that looks now. It's obviously appearing at the moment, even though we've got no content inside there. But let's just see how it looks when the URL is there. Okay, yeah, so that's the kind of thing I was after. I'll tell you what I might do as well is just add the background color and just set that as fairly transparent black color, just so it kind of distinguishes from the background on the page and stuff. So. And you can see the white text a little bit better as well. I think what I will do as well is just change the font size as well a little bit. So font size is 1.5 rems. And I think I might remove the font weight as well. I might keep it as the lighter font weight. So it's a bit easier to read the URL. Not that you'll need to read it because you'll be copying and pasting it, no doubt. Okay, so that looks pretty good now. So the only thing as mentioned is this placeholder content is kind of showing even though there's no URL there, so we don't want that. And also it probably would be good if it didn't take up the space on the page. So we're going to add a modifier class to this. So the result, if we do have an additional class of hidden on there as well, what we're going to do is say display is none, and back in our markup, if we say the result is hidden, when we go back to our content, you'll see that the element has been removed from the page. Its display property has been set to none, and obviously we're not seeing that border anymore. But when we click the create rickroll, it's not going to do anything because it's updating the element, but it's still hidden. So that's simple to fix. In our event listener here, we can actually change the classes that are applied to the element as well. So we'll say on the URL result element, let's access its class list. And then we've got some options here. So for example, removing. So we just want to remove that hidden class. And with that gone, the border and the contents will be displayed. So let's just test that out before we finish up. So let's click the button. So the element initially is hidden, and then when we click the create button, the element appears, and we've also got the content of the URL from the response from the API. So there you go, we've actually got a reasonably functioning web app now. We've got the backend API, we've got the front-end web app that can generate the URLs and actually post them to the user so they can copy them. But there's obviously lots of improvements that we can make from here on in. The next thing that we're going to do though, just before we move on, is to actually handle any errors that occur. So if the API is down, if there's any problems with it, or if there's something that's gone wrong with the code and that you've pushed up to production, we want to let the user know that there's a problem. So in the next tutorial, we'll take a look at that and how to handle the errors and display them to the user. But there you go, that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.